Why berserkers terrified everyone? For centuries, stories spread across Europe about Viking warriors who no longer seemed human. Men who felt no fear, no pain, no mercy. Warriors who charged into battle screaming like animals, ignoring wounds that should have stopped ordinary men. Some said they were cursed. Others believed they were chosen by the gods. And when the fighting started, even experienced soldiers feared them. These men became known as berserkers, but the real reason they terrified people had very little to do with myths. Because the most frightening warriors are not always the strongest. Sometimes they are the ones who appear completely beyond control. To the people who face them, berserkers look less like human beings and more like a force that had escaped human restraint itself. And that made them terrifying. The Viking world was already brutal. Cold oceans, violent raids, constant survival. Most men in the North learned early that fear could kill you faster than a sword. But berserkers represented something even darker. They represented the complete rejection of fear. At least that is how they appeared. Stories describe them entering battle in a strange state, shaking, breathing heavily, howling like wolves or bears. Some accounts claim they bit their own shields before charging forward. Others said they fought in a trance so deep that fire and steel no longer seemed to affect them. And when terrified enemies saw warriors running directly into chaos without hesitation, panic spread quickly. Because fear is contagious, but so is the absence of fear, especially in war. Modern historians still debate what berserkers truly were. Some believe they used ritualistic practices to force themselves into altered mental states. Others think certain plants or substances may have played a role. Some believe the stories were exaggerated over centuries. But one thing is certain, the fear they created was real. Because psychological warfare existed long before modern armies gave it a name. And berserkers may have understood that better than almost anyone. War is not only about killing, it is about breaking the mind of the enemy before the battle is even over. Imagine standing in a shield wall during the Viking Age. Cold air, mud beneath your feet, the sound of weapons striking wood. And then somewhere through the smoke and confusion, you see them. Not calm, not disciplined, not afraid, screaming, charging, moving like men who no longer care whether they survive. That alone could destroy morale. Because most people expect fear in battle. Fear feels human, but berserkers seem to abandon it completely. And people do not know how to react when they face someone who appears to have nothing left to lose. That uncertainty created legends. Over time, the stories became even darker. Some claim berserkers possess supernatural strength. Others believed they could not be harmed by normal weapons. Stories describe them surviving impossible wounds and continuing to fight long after ordinary men would collapse. And in the medieval world, where myth and reality constantly mixed together, those stories spread quickly, especially after raids, especially after massacres, especially after terrified survivors carried those memories home. But the truth behind berserkers may actually be more disturbing than the legends themselves, because they were probably still human, which means their terrifying behavior came not from magic, but from psychology, from conditioning, belief, ritual, and the brutal world that created them. The Viking Age rewarded aggression. Strength mattered, reputation mattered, fearlessness mattered. In many ways, Viking society admired men who appeared larger than ordinary life itself, and berserkers embodied that ideal in its most extreme form. But there was also a deeper reason they emerged. The North was unforgiving, life was uncertain, violence was common, death was always close. Over time, harsh worlds create harsh mentalities. And some men learn not only to survive fear, but to weaponize it. That is what made berserkers different. They turned terror itself into part of the battle. Long before swords collided, the psychological attack had already begun. The sounds, the appearance, the unpredictability, all of it mattered. Because human beings fear chaos. And berserkers looked like chaos in human form. Even their connection to animals added to the fear surrounding them. The word berserker is often associated with bears. Other accounts connected certain warriors to wolves, powerful predators, violent hunters, creatures feared across the forests of the north. In Viking mythology and culture, animals carried symbolic power. And some warriors may have intentionally embraced those identities before battle, not simply to intimidate enemies, but to psychologically transform themselves. Because once people stop seeing themselves as ordinary men, they begin behaving differently. And that transformation can become dangerous, especially when violence is involved. But berserkers were not unstoppable. Despite the myths, many likely died the same way ordinary warriors did. Steel still cut flesh. Arrows still killed. Battles still ended in blood and exhaustion. Yet the legend survived. And that matters because history often remembers fear longer than facts. The image of a screaming Viking warrior charging through battle became larger than reality itself. And over centuries, the berserker transformed from warrior into myth. But myths do not emerge from nothing. Something about these men genuinely terrified people, not only because of violence, but because they seemed to cross a line most humans are afraid to cross, the line between control and chaos. Most warriors throughout history fought while trying to remain disciplined. Berserkers appeared to do the opposite. They embraced emotional fury instead of suppressing it, and to many people that looked horrifying. Because deep down, human beings understand how dangerous uncontrolled rage can become, especially in groups, especially during war. That may explain why berserkers still fascinate people today. Not because they were superheroes, not because they were invincible, but because they represented a terrifying possibility, the possibility of humans abandoning restraint entirely. And history has shown many times what happens when violence loses restraint. But the Viking world also romanticized these warriors. Stories turned them into symbols of raw courage and unstoppable aggression. Young warriors likely grew up hearing tales about legendary fighters who never retreated and never showed fear. And stories shape behavior. The more society glorifies fearlessness, the more some men will try to become fearless themselves, even if it destroys them. Because fear exists for a reason. Fear protects people. Fear slows people down. Fear prevents reckless decisions. Berserkers seem to reject all of that. And rejection of fear can look powerful for a short time, but it can also become self-destructive. Some historical accounts even suggest berserkers became difficult to control outside battle. Violent, unstable, dangerous even to allies. If true, that would make sense. Because once someone trains themselves to live constantly near rage and violence, returning to normal life becomes difficult. War changes people, sometimes permanently. And perhaps that is the darkest part of the berserker legend. Not the screaming, not the blood, not the battlefield, but the possibility that these men slowly transform themselves into weapons. And weapons are not built for peace. Over time, as Viking society evolved and kingdoms became more organized, berserkers slowly disappeared from history. The world changed. Armies became more disciplined. Kings demanded control. Christianity spread across the north. And chaotic warriors who terrified everyone around them no longer fit the future that was coming. But the story survived. Because fear survives, especially the fear of people who appear beyond reason. Even now, centuries later, the image remains powerful. A warrior standing beneath dark northern skies, breathing heavily before battle, preparing to abandon fear completely. And maybe that is why berserkers still fascinate the modern world, because they force us to confront something uncomfortable about human nature. The line between courage and madness is often much thinner than people want to believe. And once that line disappears, human beings can become terrifying indeed.